Hello and welcome to today's how-to video from eWard Winning Outdoors at ewardwinning94.wordpress.com. Today we're going to be talking about how to use a hand sewing awl or stitching awl. The particular one I'm using here is the Speedy Stitcher. There are several other varieties available online or at craft stores and stuff, but they all work essentially the same. This particular one I purchased as a kit. Comes with instructions, which we'll set aside, a roll of this wax-coated heavy-duty thread, which I'll set aside for now as well, and then the actual sewing awl itself, which is part of what I'm going to show you here. I will include a link in the comments to where you can purchase this awl or one similar to it. But the basic parts of it, there is a very heavy-duty, very sharp needle up here in the front that if you're not careful you can run right through your finger, and it's held in place by a chuck that's very similar to putting a drill bit in place. And then on the back end there's this metal cap thing that you can pull out, and within that is the spool of thread. So you take the thread, make sure there's enough on the spool to do the job you want to do, and then you thread it out through this little hole on the side of the awl. Put this cap back in just to hold it in place so it doesn't dump on you while you're trying to work. And then you can come up and actually wrap once or more if you need to around this little post on the side, and that just provides some tension on it. Then you thread it through this groove, and there's a little hole there if you can see it, up through, actually through the needle, and then, or not, yeah, through the needle, and then out through the side of the needle. The needle itself actually has a groove in it there that helps to hold the thread, but basically that's the way you set it up. When you're ready to sew, you're going to want to pull some extra out, and better to pull too much than too little, because if you wind up short, it's not going to be able to do what you need it to do. It kind of peeled a little bit of wax off there. You can actually kind of see here as I pulled it that it pulled loose a little bit from the side of the needle. That groove is actually where that thread will run as you're sewing. And then when it comes time to sew, I've got just a piece of scrap leather here. I found it is very helpful to have a wood block or something underneath it, because you need to be able to use some force to push your thread through whatever you're sewing. This device will sew through, this is some fairly heavy leather, and I've sewed right through that. It would sew through a backpacking strap, jeans, anything that you need to sew that's way too heavy for your sewing machine. I've sewed for years by hand and by machine, and actually broke the gears out of my original sewing machine several times sewing stuff that was way too heavy for it, until finally it was obvious that that was not going to work, and it was getting more and more expensive to fix. So my wife bought me a replacement sewing machine and told me never to sew that kind of stuff with it again, which, as usual, she was right. So with this sewing awl, it will sew that kind of heavy duty stuff. It would sew right through backpack straps. It would sew something heavy duty like seatbelt material. However, I would say don't ever use this on anything that is a life-sustaining device. You could sew a climbing harness or something with it. You could sew a seatbelt with it. But unless you really truly know the strength of the material, how many stitches per inch, and all those other very detailed specs to maintain the original strength of that, I would not recommend it. But if your backpack strap broke, the worst, you're not going to die if your backpack strap breaks again. So this would be a great way to do it. I've used it for leather craft projects. You can use it for any kind of stuff like that, just not for something where your life depends on it. To use it though, it's a fairly simple process. You start wherever you're going to sew, and I'm just going to kind of do a little section along there. I like to have a wood block because you can just push right through the leather into the wood and not have to worry about hitting your table or your finger. If your finger was in the way of that, you'd run that needle right through it. So you shove it all the way through like that, and then just back off a little bit, and that creates a loop that hopefully you can see readily there. After your first stitch, you want to take another tool and stick it through that loop, and what you want to do is basically just pull all of that extra thread all the way through. So now I've got thread pulled through on the back side of my material. I'm going to back up and go over just the distance that I want one stitch, run it through again, back off just a hair to create that loop, and then at this point, this is where the actual stitching and interlocking goes. So I'm going to take the end of that thread, run it through that loop I created when I backed up just a little bit, and back through. And now you have one stitch. Now I'm going to go over the distance of one stitch, repeat that process. And I'm not being super careful here about precision stitching because I'm just trying to show the process. But try to keep your needle at the same direction each time so your stitching doesn't wind up all twisted together. Back it off, snug it up a little bit. I'm going to go over one more stitch and do that again. Go through, back off to create that loop. Hopefully you're a little less clumsy than I am and you can run that end back through that loop there. Pull it, and that's really all there is to it. You're basically doing similar to what a sewing machine might do, except you're doing it with a single piece of thread, and you're just doing it a single stitch at a time. So this is obviously less precise and much less fast than a sewing machine, because you could easily vary your stitch length and wind up getting really inconsistent stitches. But when you're done, you can actually pull it and you'll have a series of stitches right along the leather or whatever you're working with there that will be very sturdy. And then it's really easy once you've done that to, at the end when you're done, pull your thread back through. Let's say in this case I'm going to do one final stitch. I'll back off a little bit, pull some extra thread through with my other little tool here. Just pull some slack there. Pull that slack through. I'll just cut it off on this side. Pull that on through, make sure it's snugged up the way I want so both sides are fairly even. And then I can tie a knot in that. And if I wanted to really reinforce it, I could reinforce that knot with a drop or two of super glue. And that's really all there is to it. You can use this for leather, for, like I say, backpack type straps, heavy upholstery material, or whatever kind of stuff you want. Now, I don't know if you can see it very well in the video, but my stitches here, I had a little bit more tension on it to where they really, almost the top piece is just straight with each bottom piece coming up and through. You can just adjust that a little bit by pulling the tension on whichever side needs to be tighter to where you get really nice, neat stitches. So that's really all there is to it. It's a fairly simple device, very handy to use, and I will include a link down below to where you can find one if it's something you think would be useful to you. Enjoy your crafting and your repairing.